How many times have I said to somebody in the last decade, you're a fantastic negotiator, you can pull an RFP together and analyze data and in such an immense way, massive thumbs up. You manage your stakeholders kind of okay, but if you can get your people skills up, you'll go from being a really good buyer to being amazing. And it is that more people-centric side that shifts the dial in terms of how we work together and the outcomes that you can get to.
Hello and welcome to Diverse and Inclusive Leaders. This is the show where I speak with the most inspirational and thought-provoking leaders of today and unearth their unique stories of diversity and inclusion to help inspire, educate and motivate others to make the world a better place. My guest today is Clare Costello. Clare is the Chief People and Inclusion Officer at the Co-op. She took the role on a temporary basis in the summer of last year, but was made permanent from September. It's a fascinating role because Clare's background and history is working for some of the most well-known retail organisations, including Walmart and Asda, but typically within the procurement function. She's now taken on the people role in addition and inclusion, and it'll be really fascinating to speak to her today about her journey and the intersection with all these different dynamics. Welcome to the show, Clare.
Hi, Leila. Lovely to see you. Nice to be here. Hello, everybody.
Clare, I've been really excited about having you on the show, and especially because of my geeky interest in diversity and procurement, supply chain, and how that meets D&I, which I know we'll be talking about very shortly. Before we dive in, talk to us a little bit about how you came to be where you are today, because it all started with figures and accountancy, didn't it?
It did, and I don't often admit the old finance background, having been out of it for longer than I was ever in it. But yeah, I've always had a real passion for business generally. So it goes back to doing a finance and accounting degree, having the joy of a year in France, which opened up that whole cultural aspect of thinking about things differently and thinking about Europe as well as Britain. So yeah, I did. I started my life in the world of being a management accountant. So a couple of years working with Smith and Nephew, amazing organisation. Don't recommend walking around wound healing factories on a Friday lunchtime because it puts you off your lunch, but learned a lot. Then moved over to Asda, and literally, I would say probably for the last 28 years, I've spent my life in retail. So Asda was a fantastic learning ground. Spent about 6 years in finance there, looking after different areas, and really got to know a lot about the business. Was really fortunate to have a year out and went and played and did the travelling route that a lot of people do after university. So I did it as a young adult, and then went back in and went, oh, actually, this isn't what I want to do anymore. But again, big organisation, opportunity came up. What was a customer, as in procurement, said, do you fancy coming over and having a look? It is quite a common route to go from finance into procurement, so that's quite an easy step over. And if you're like me and you've always liked manufacturing, it's the closest you're going to get to it, being in a retail footprint. So that was how I switched from finance into procurement. But actually, and it does link, funnily enough, into the whole D&I conversation that we've been having together over the last few months. It was because at the time we were starting to work with Walmart Germany. So there was a whole piece around how do you bring two different cultures together? How do you leverage together? How do you work together? And how do you work with those very different supply chains? And there was a lot of learning that came from that. And again, it all filters into what does it mean to have different people and to be inclusive in your thinking and to be inclusive in the way that different people want to approach problems. So perfect example was around planning time. True Brit, the target on that is 5%-ish. That feels comfortable. True German, how did you calculate it? Can you give me the logic behind it? British, kind of gut feel, feels okay, in line with the market. Germans, no, that doesn't work for me. I want to know exactly how you calculated it. So even at a very base level, understanding those cultural differences and how you work with people from different backgrounds started filtering through the career. And yeah, you're right. I spent a good period of time working in procurement in Asda, and I had a really fantastic opportunity to work with Walmart globally, working closely with their international markets, again, understanding how those different cultures from a customer point of view impacted what they needed to do, but how they as organisations fitted together and what it meant for them as colleagues, but how you then shared best practice and kind of distinguished things in a way that meant that they were unique to the area, but common across the industry as a procurement professional. Couple of years working with Walmart, but being based in the UK. We speak the same language, but we really, really don't. Even simple things like, can I put that in my diary? No, you have to say calendar, because otherwise they thought I was writing a personal journal. So very quickly learned that the language is a big difference between the two. And then about 3.5 years ago, skipped over to Co-op to do procurement with them as their CPO. And yeah, you're absolutely right. This summer, stepped out of procurement into the people function. And yeah, massively enjoying it, and so much more in common than you would think.
It's such a fascinating move. And I know I'd said to you before this, it's rare, but I actually thought, how many other people do I know that have done that who are in post right now? Nil. It's a really unusual yet fascinating move. And especially when you think about all of the different pieces around diversity and inclusion and cultural nuances, which you point to there, the Americans, the Germans, even France, we're a stone's throw away. It's such a different culture. All of that translating into the people function, and especially in the current environment of ESG and the societal aspects being really going through the roof. I think it is a fascinating move. It's finance to procurement to people. Really, I'll be. I mean, it's exciting to see what's going to be next. Really.
Oh, don't! I'm too scared. I'm happy to stay put for a while. I'm learning a lot in this space. We'll stay settled for a little bit longer yet. But you're right. But there are some things that are really similar. So I've always talked about procurement as being high to retire. And when you think about people, we always talk about that function as being high to retire, and how you look after your colleagues from the moment in which you're trying to engage them as being potentially interested in joining you, through to how you develop them with their career with you, and you're looking after them in the right way, that you're looking after their health, their well-being and their development, through to what is the right move for them, and then they choose to leave the organisation, hopefully as real advocates in whatever they choose to do next. And actually that thinking process is exactly the same in the supply chain. You know, we're working with suppliers day in and day out. You get approached by, oh gosh, a gazillion and one new suppliers every single day, all saying, we're amazing, please talk to me. So you have to learn to have a bit of a hard shell to say, I'd love to, but I'd spend my whole life doing nothing but that if I spoke to everyone. But that whole, how do you bring somebody on board and help them work with you in the culture that you've got within your organisation for both of you to be successful? How do you then ensure that when they are working with you, it isn't simply about, oh, that's the contract and we'll leave you running. It is about, how do we continue to develop that relationship, and how do we work with you in a way that really grows the values and cultures that we've got as an organisation. So it could be something as simple as, do you want to engage with us on the levy share scheme, where you'll put some of your spare monies for the apprenticeship level that you're not spending into the pot that we've got, so that we can then do good with it. You know, do you engage with us on the values that we've got as an organisation? And for most of our, you know, certainly larger strategic suppliers, the answer is 100% yes. And they want to get involved in the community initiatives that we're looking to work on. So that kind of development logic and thinking is very similar and applicable between the two areas. And then again, how you exit a relationship. You know, there are, you know, everybody's sad when the relationship needs to change, but there are times when that does need to happen for the benefit of everybody. So it's how you choose to make that exit and then, you know, move to a new supplier. So the process and the thinking of how you step back is actually very, very similar.
This is absolutely fascinating, and truly, I think that juxtaposition of having incredibly high emotional intelligence and empathy, yet also being able to draw that quote unquote, I know you said hard shoulder, but actually having that business line that says, look, this is operationally and most efficiently what is going to be good for the business, which ultimately is better for the wider organization and therefore the wider community by way of knock-on effect. Might be difficult decisions in the short term, but actually it makes much more sense longer term. And I really do believe that the very best leaders have got that juxtaposition just right. And it's a really difficult one to master. I've even found it myself where, look, we're all human beings, we all have feelings. You want to be a nice person. It's difficult not to want intrinsically to be liked and to have tough conversations, especially when they can be so personal to the individual.
Yeah.
And I guess, the suppliers as well, when looking at both of those different roles, it's a challenging piece to break when there's personal relationships there.
That you're absolutely right. And that approach is something that, through your career, my career, that you learn a little bit of resilience with, but you also learn, I think, very quickly that just being very clear, very honest, and being clear at when you can't tell them something. So, my team will hopefully say, Claire will always say, I can't tell you that right now, but when I can tell you, I will. So I'll always draw the line on what can and can't be shared, but just being as transparent as you possibly can and being honest. I think there's a real kindness in being very transparent and honest, even if that message isn't what somebody wants to hear. So, you are an amazing supplier, but I've got this issue and this is what we need to do together to fix it. It's no different to, you're an amazing colleague. I absolutely believe you've got the right intentions, but these are the areas that you need to develop on to be successful. You can do it in a way that's really fair and transparent. You have to be kind. You don't have to be, aggressive and bang the table. You can be very kind and 100% mean the messaging that you're putting across, but still be very honest with it, because ultimately you want them to be successful and you want them to be happy. And whether it's a supplier or a colleague, ultimately that joint benefit is where you're both winning, isn't it? And that's the bit for me that I've always kind of hung those difficult decisions on. Can I truly say I'm doing the right thing for everybody globally? And is this, in the larger scheme, is the intention right, and is the outcome the best that we can in the circumstances that we're in? And if I hold that true, then you can deliver any tough message.
I'm not just saying this here, Claire, but honestly, it is true. The brilliant thing about you, and since I've got to know you, is you really challenge the status quo and the stereotypes on a number of different levels. And for anyone listening who's a procurement professional, I used to recruit a lot of CPOs and such, so please don't dislike me. But and I'm talking to a procurement professional here, so it's okay. But I would always, back in the day, have almost thought myself, I can recognize the type of personality within this arena. And actually, when you think of buyers, you think of procurement, sometimes there is that stereotype of fist beating on the table that says, I'm nailing people down to smallest margins, yada, yada. But what you do, Claire, and you do so very well, is you are honest and transparent, even in the face of adversity. Fairness and kindness is absolutely critical, and it is for the greater good. But the way you do it is so true and authentic. And whilst it sounds simple for those that are listening, it's actually a much more difficult thing to do in practice. I've had it myself a number of times, and I find myself swinging. One day I'll feel like, I'm a great manager, I'm a great leader, I'm doing it, it's worked out well. And the next minute I'll be thinking, oh God, I went in with that, it was a little bit too emotional, probably, a bit too cutting. But there's constantly finding that balance between almost the swing of the pendulum. And so being able to master that art is a really delicate yet difficult piece to do. And within what, let's face it, was classically quite a male dominated and quite a quite a certain personality type of arena, and I can say just I recruited in that area for a number of years, there is almost that stereotype. What we need more so now of, especially in an economic climate that is as it is more genuine honesty and transparency.
I think there's a real shift change across procurement in particular. We have still got a fair chunk of traditional, as you would describe it, procurement professionals out there, and there is a space for that. There is a place where that's the right thing for them, and there's certain industries where that works. But if you look across the footprint, we have a much more broader home now for styles. And I think that sense of collaboration that we've seen so successfully in very people-centric organisations has filtered its way into many more of the procurement footprints now, and recognizing that if you behave that way with your team, with your colleagues, with your stakeholders, and generate amazing results off the back of it, why wouldn't you apply that same courtesy, number one, but kind of perspective when you're talking to your supply base. So I quite often look on LinkedIn, and there's a fair few people on there who post really regularly, and I absolutely adore them. They are brilliant, and it's just so heartwarming, but actually really positive to see the profession itself starting to lift up and lift into being much more collaborative. Because you're absolutely right. In the same way as we need to engage our colleagues, we want them to be really part of the organisation. To be successful, they've got to care. Our suppliers, we are so dependent on them, and supply chains are incredibly difficult. The economic environment isn't just difficult for us; it's difficult for everybody. So we do have to collaborate in a way that we've never had to do before, and to do that successfully, you've got to have some strength of relationship. So those skills are that nuance between being a really good buyer and being a great buyer. And I've probably have spent, and I'm just laughing because I'm thinking back to my old Asda days, and those buyers that have worked with me and left, they'll all be smiling if they heard this. How many times have I said to somebody in the last decade, you're a fantastic negotiator, you can pull an RFP together and analyze data and in such an immense way, massive thumbs up. You manage your stakeholders kind of okay, but if you can get your people skills up, you'll go from being a really good buyer to being amazing. And it is that more people-centric side that shifts the dial in terms of how we work together and the outcomes that you can get to, because that's where you can really get into those difficult conversations, or complex conversations. So I know you and I talked a little bit before about diversity in the supply chain. If you're a large organization, it can be quite hard to bring new suppliers in. So can you imagine how hard it is then to bring in small suppliers who need nurturing, or diverse suppliers who have never worked with a large organization before, and the support package that you need to put around that can be quite difficult. Working with a larger supplier, you can say to them, well, how can we work with you to bring some of these in as well, because you're smaller than us and you might be more nimble. And so it's thinking a bit differently and saying it's not just your direct footprint, it's your overall footprint. But those conversations aren't easy. So if you don't have that relationship and you don't have that trust, you can't step it on from being transactional. It's got to be much more thoughtful and much more projected over a longer period of time.
There's a number of things I'd love to pick out in what you said there. And first of all, caveating my last point, some of the most brilliant people I've met have been in procurement and have had excellent people skills and been able to manage that really well. One such example, Jim Townsend, who's a former CPO for Walgreen Boots Alliance. The program that they had during the pandemic, actually, with the vaccine rollout into Black and Brown communities and looking at impacting lower socioeconomic areas through the procurement and supply chain piece and through the work that they did, was just absolutely phenomenal. And you also see organizations such as the $1 Billion Roundtable, which I think is superb. To your point, the difficulty bringing on new suppliers when actually perhaps the integration is huge, or it's some people like RPOs or like processed outsourcing models with other organizations so embedded. To unpick that, even though it might be the better thing longer term, is actually quite challenging. But what's really heartening to see is that large organizations, and we're a testament of this, are able to work with large organizations. Yes, the pain point sometimes can come if there is 30, 60, 90-day payment, and oh goodness, when you look at those, you think, wow, it's not necessarily set up that way. But the brilliant thing is supply chain and also the people function have an ability to actually positively impact that over the long run. And we are seeing some of the trends move towards businesses and organizations like Billion Dollar Roundtable then being recognized not only for their economic impact, but also for the amount of spend that they have into diverse or minority-owned organizations.
Definitely. And social enterprises as well would be the other one that I'd bring into that, because predominantly they tend to be owned and supported by diverse footprints as well. So there's many ways that you can really change the dynamic of the footprint that you have as a supply base, but also do something that's different for the community, and think about how you are spreading your impact across that broader footprint. Because it's about bringing them into the organization, but more importantly, it's about positively impacting that community around them to help everybody kind of elevate up. I love the American expression that a lot of the Walmart guys used to use. It's like raising the water and all boats raise together. And I was like, it took me ages to get my head around that, but actually it's a really nice, all boats rise with the tide together. It's like, well, it's true, isn't it? And that's what we want to do, is to help everybody elevate up and give everybody that chance.
You put that really nicely there. And when I heard you saying that, I was immediately drawn to the to equity ultimately. And no, it's probably, I'm teaching some people who are listening in thinking, oh, I already know about equity, but it's such a poignant difference, equity between equality, because it's ultimately distributing different levels of resource depending on the individual. And so actually treating people differently is, in a way, the best way to go. And so to your point with the boats example, which I think is just lovely, is you start to make changes within process for one or two, actually, it then does open the floodgates. Claire, I'm really keen to know your take on where you see the future is going. When you were in procurement, I know you'll bring lots of those methodologies into the people arena. You're winning awards like the Procurement Power List, which we've seen. It's like, ooh, who's on the power list this year? I do love having a little look at those things. I can't help it, and seeing who's on there. But they're always fantastic individuals. Being at the cutting edge of supply chain involves certain knowledge and foresight. Where do you see the future when it comes to procurement, diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity, and also people? Are there any key trends around well, ESG as well, again, of course, fits well into this?
It does, doesn't it? And actually this is where double hatting, as I am at the minute, works really well. There's quite a lot of conversations I have which bridge both the teams that I'm currently supporting. I will eventually move to just one, but whilst I'm still looking after both, it works quite well. So I think D&I is definitely here to stay from a procurement point of view, and obviously social mobility, which is inclusive of D&I from a people perspective. Certainly in my footprint across retail, and definitely within Co-op, because it is so embedded within the core that we are, it is absolutely definitely here to stay. And why do I sound so definitive on that? It's because it's the only way in which both sectors are going to retain, attract, develop and grow. And all areas are looking for that fresh thinking, that it overuses the word diversity, but that diversity of thought, those different perspectives, the power of the collective and the different ways in which people operate. The risk you have in certain industries is we all go into kind of mind melt and speak with one voice, because there's a certain way that retailers work, there's a certain way that financial services work. So that difference of approach is what brings the freshness and agility and an ability to innovate and scale. So in both sectors, I see that as being something that will continue. The bit from a procurement point of view that I get really heartened about is that ESG itself is becoming such a hot topic for investors, for shareholders, that most procurement professionals would love to be able to invest more of their time saying, I'm not just looking at the numbers, I'm looking at the whole. And there are a fair few of us who are fortunate enough to work for organisations where that's been part of what we've done for a while, but would still like to be able to do it a bit more and have it in that balanced conversation. So, in what we do, the good news is if you're being environmentally aware, it's generally being more carbon aware, which is generally more cost effective anyway, subject to the investment you might need to make up front. So there are some decisions that you just go, well, that just makes sense. Why wouldn't you just do that? Putting one more item in the bag analogy so that you don't have to have another bag. Why wouldn't you do that? But it isn't necessarily naturally then falling into, well, what does that then mean in terms of supporting society more broadly? So what do we mean by social value? What do we mean by driving apprenticeships to enable people from different backgrounds to get into a profession that they may not have got into, or just get into a job that they may not have got into because of the educational challenges that they may have faced, during their youth. And actually how we work together, and I will use the co-op as an example, working with some of our direct suppliers, by having a large contract with them, we work with them to say, well, we want some social value within that contract that we have with you. So this is what we'll pay for the service. How are you going to work with us to help the community around us? And we actually build in specific things that they will work on with us that benefit them. They want to have an apprenticeship, but we'll link it into one of our academies. So we can bring, kids in to give them access to apprenticeships that they would never have got access to before. So that ESG aspect is something that is definitely becoming a stronger foothold in procurement. And certainly the environmental side of it is not going to disappear, because none of us are blind, and we can see that our supply chains are going to require that propensity to be in future safe. And the only way we're going to be future safe is if we start to work together. How it filters into our people footprint is really clear that, we need to attract people who want to work with us. And this is so competitive. I was talking to the recruitment team just on Monday, funnily enough, about procurement recruitment, and there are 0.7 candidates for every job in Manchester. So I haven't even necessarily got the volume of people available to put in. Yet we have a phenomenal amount of people that apply for the jobs. But what that tells us is that we've got a lot of people who are trying to punch above their weight to get into the next role, and they possibly don't always have the caliber of background to be able to step on and be successful at this point. So therefore, how do you attract that 0.7 to you rather than a bank or another retailer or an online organization? So ESG in terms of what they see and what they feel and what they hear, and it isn't just about what we do as an organization directly of co-ops really known for being fair trade in the food sector, or co-ops known for genuinely caring and having some amazing funeral services for our clients in that footprint. And actually look at that, go and look at their pet insurance. Isn't that fantastic? That's great from a customer point of view. It's what they hear around. So it's what they hear suppliers say about us. It's what they hear colleagues say about us. It's what they hear people who work for suppliers and are dealing with us say about it. So that ESG environment is much, much broader in terms of how it filters out. And that's how we will attract and retain fantastic talent within our business. So it does become very intersectional in terms of how that broader environment out there, economic environment out there, looks at us and helps us attract people in.
ESG and the S out of ESG is one of my favourite subjects, as my team know, especially at the moment. And it's interesting because when we started this conversation and we were talking about where does procurement fit into people, actually we've now come to this point in the conversation where you can kind of clearly see how the two intertwine. And when you overlay ESG and the fact that we've been talking about environment really and putting in actions, and it's become a lot more, not palatable, is that not quite the right words, but more household discussion around environmental issues over the last 2 decades. A lot of analysts are saying that that is exactly what we will see for S and the social aspects, which, as you rightly say, it's critical for talent attraction, retention in the first place. And also because we've got these 5 generations in the workforce right now, and the vast proportion of them, millennials, Gen X, Z, etc., care so much more about the social and the purpose-led values. The challenge that I have heard people discuss still, and I'd be really interested to know your take on this, is how to measure the social aspects of ESG. And this is a lot of what we've been doing here at Dial around 10 dimensions of diversity and various other areas. But we're really diving in deep at the moment. I was speaking to a researcher, funnily enough, about this morning, saying, I genuinely don't believe that there is a blueprint or an industry standard for S, because again, I'm being a little controversial and provocative here, but diversity and inclusion, as example, is a relatively unregulated industry. What is D&I? Haven't we all got the personal lived experience to a certain extent? But how are we actually standardizing and measuring S and making sure it's something that is scientifically tracked and measured, as opposed to something that we just put on our corporate investor page on our website?
Yeah, that is such a timely and ongoing conversation in our own organisation right now. And actually was something that we talked about at a procurement conference not that long ago, probably about 9 months or so ago. So there was a question raised there where they were talking about public sector, because obviously they've had the white paper where it's been an obligation on government and local governments to build social value into their tender activity. And again, I've got a whole set of viewpoints on that, and I think it cuts out, a real opportunity. So we went a slightly different direction when we started doing it. But you're right, there isn't a single measure. And the way I described it when I was asked the question was, the social value part of ESG feels like where the environmental side was about a decade ago, where we had 3 or 4 different ways of measuring carbon. We had different, is it carbon or is it something else? Is it financial or is it in weight? And if you think about, again, I'll use retail example because it's really applicable, but a very different approach. When we were looking at waste and we were trying to decide how to be a more effective country on how we managed waste, retailers were measured on weight. So they were told to reduce the weight of waste that they were putting out. So everybody moved out of glass and into plastic. A decade later, we're all saying, whoa, plastic's not the right solution. Everybody coming out of plastic and moving into metals and glass again, or just, trying to dilute into something completely different. So the science changes around, which is, I think, equivalent to society changing around and, and what becomes more acceptable and what becomes more normalized. So that's kind of one bit. But the actual measurement of it is definitely feels very similar to that environment that we were in about a decade ago on the environment footprint. So you're right, there is not one single measure yet that you can look at and say, I can compare apples with apples, because everybody's using their own metrics. Internally, and I've not even seen it yet, so this is like right hot off the press, I understand the community team have actually been doing quite a lot of work on it, and they've come up with some methodologies that they're going to start trialing in their own footprint. So this is why I'm saying it's hot off the press, because it was last week and I went, that's really interesting. Can I see it in procurement? Because we've been doing all of this work with suppliers, and can I see it in people? Because they work really closely with us anyway. But if you're trialing this in your community footprint, how do I apply that to the apprenticeship work that we do internally, or to the social, or to the apprenticeship work that we're doing through the levy funds externally? And how do we apply it to our D&I activity? And how do we apply it to working with prisons and trying to figure out how we help people back into employment? There's loads of different dynamics here. So it genuinely is such an early stage of development that there isn't a one size fits all. But I do think it's a bit more complicated than the E, because there are so many more facets to it. If they just nailed one of them, I'd be delighted.
Oh my goodness, Claire. For those that are listening to this podcast, I've literally been aggressively nodding like Churchill the dog and smiling for the last couple of minutes that you've been talking, Claire, because it excites me so much. My inner geek literally comes out. And I think, this trend that we keep coming back to throughout this conversation is it's like procurement to people, from E to S, measuring, managing, tracking it. How can we utilize those transferable methodologies with what is an increasingly intelligent pool of stakeholders? Because the intelligence levels, the knowledge levels of all of these different stakeholders, all of those different layers of the onion, to your point, around all these different dimensions, from grassroots right up to board level, into the suppliers, the supply chain, and then our customers, already in my mind, I'm seeing this whole matrix and onion layering upon layering upon layering on itself. And so definitely another conversation to be had. I'd love to speak to some of your colleagues about that measurement of the S, because I've been reading up so much about it. In fact, I've just enrolled on a course which is all around the wealth economy framework. It's a framework looking at sustainability beyond GDP. And I am convinced, to your point, that even if we just get one or two of these things right, we live in a world now that's evolving anyway. So you just start to evolve these frameworks, evolve the blueprint, same way that has been done in E. But you're absolutely right. It is far more, I think, it's far more challenging because the S has always been something that we haven't necessarily managed, and it feels like some of the softer elements, when actually that's the currency that we're now working with in a modern day era.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and like D&I measurement, the data piece of it, you just kind of go, well, that should be really easy. And I learned very quickly, because I asked the question moving into the people function, well, surely we've got all of this data, da, da, da. Well, no, because it relies on individuals feeling safe and secure enough to actually go in and put that information in there. So even what you would perceive to be what should be really simple data to have, to allow you to have a start point to then say, are the interventions that you're making actually making a difference, can suddenly become much harder, because these are more emotive, more personal, have a big brother fear factor that can sit with them. And so alongside needing the data comes a whole added layer of wanting and needing change management, people skills to encourage people and ensure that they understand the why behind why you're asking for that information, but the how in terms of making them understand that it is safe, it is secure, it's not used by anybody, it's only this way that it's pulled. Because even at the most fundamental level, the whole what gets measured gets done. If you don't even know what your start point is, you don't know how to move from it. So the S piece of it is really much more complex than I think a lot of people have really got their heads around.
Absolutely agree. I could speak to you all day. I'm going to ask you two, because we've just got time for two lightning round questions. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to answer each, with the hardest one first on the spot. What does success look like to you?
Oh gosh, that is really hard, isn't it? What does success look like for me? A team that know the direction that they're heading in, with a stakeholder base that have bought into that.
I'm laughing just because I love that. It's such a procurement meets people answer, but it's absolutely right on the money. And also, I guess if you were to go back in time, and I'm going to give you a bit longer actually than 30 seconds for this, but if you were to go back in time and speak to the much younger Claire, who's embarking on accountancy, she's in the Midlands, she's wondering whether she wants to be north, whether she wants to be south, what the situation is, what advice would you give to your younger self, or indeed someone who is at a similar place in their career and really keen to be in a role like yours one day?
I wished that, well, first of all, it was a different time because I'm a bit of an old dude. But you're right, it was a much more male-dominated environment moving into procurement from finance. I think I wish somebody had said to me, worry less about trying to plan your career, and worrying about how do I get to that next level, because it will happen. There's a bit around luck, there always is, but there's a bit around having the right people around you, and there's a bit about just consolidating and continuing to work hard and being visible. And the risks that you are taking are absolutely fine. So, I think jumping from finance to procurement, looking back, was such a safe jump. But at the time, felt like I was, I'd qualified. I've been a qualified accountant for, a number of years. It felt like I was throwing away almost like 9 years worth of experience, having done it as a degree and then into work following that. And that was such a difficult decision personally at the time. I just wish somebody had said, these scary moments are the bit that make you. Don't worry about it. It's absolutely fine. Here are examples of other people that have done it. Off you go. So actually making the move this time, although I have to say I was sat there going, why am I doing this? I know it's going to be great, but why am I doing this? The fear factor wasn't quite there as much because I know I've done it once before. What I'd learned as an older person that I wished had been told to me as a younger person is you quickly find there's 2 or 3 people that you can talk to. Who's your safety net? That you can say, I'm having a, oh my gosh moment. I'm having an imposter syndrome moment. I'm having a, I just don't know this moment. And as long as you've got that safety net, do you know what? You'll be fine. You'll be absolutely fine because they wouldn't have asked you to do the job if they didn't think you could do it.
Claire, that's such a nice way to end what has been such an insightful podcast. It's been a joy having you on the show. Thank you so much. I feel I selfishly have got to dive into some subjects that I'm incredibly interested in, but I know it'll have been very, very interesting and informative as well for our listeners. To mention a couple of pieces that I particularly enjoyed, and if you have missed any of this, don't worry, you can catch up in the show notes at the end of today's show. But from a learning perspective, really challenging the status quo, challenging the stereotypes. Just because you started or you've studied in one arena does not mean that that is what you are for the rest of your career. Taking some of these risks, as the famous book goes, I think it was Dale Carnegie, I could be wrong here, but feel the fear and do it anyway. Also, Claire, the foresight that you shared and the trends for the future and how relatable and translatable certain skills are into different arenas, I think is incredibly inspiring. Having come from a talent background myself and seeing the challenge, not only from hiring managers, but from candidates themselves, thinking that they must stay within the same sector, within the same discipline, you are proof that you can do it, and you can do it across such large organizations, large and wide kind of job roles and functions. And actually you can bring a far more innovative approach, which frankly in the modern day era, when investors and all of our different stakeholder groups are becoming far more intelligent and insightful, actually it is something that we can all take heed of, and certainly all take a leaf out of your book.
Thank you. It's been lovely talking with you this afternoon.
Thanks so much, Claire. My name is Leila McKenzie-Delis. You've been listening to the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast show brought to you by Dial Global. If you missed anything, you can catch up in the show notes, but make sure you hit download and subscribe. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast channel. Visit us at www.dialglobal.org/podcast, and we'll look forward to seeing you again very soon.